Hello and welcome to CripChat, your weekly podcast on everything disability. I'm your host, Jonathan Shar, and today we have lots joys from the Australian Federation of Disability Organizations. Hello, Ross. How
Hi,
are
Jonathan.
you?
I'm very well, thank you, and it's great to be back on your show again.
Briefly explain the campaign's mission to create a disability inclusive and equitable Australia by 2031.
Yeah, happy to, Jonathan. And the overarching theme, as you've just outlined, is to get politicians, the parties, and everybody involved, the independents, to commit to a disability inclusive and equitable Australia by 2031. What we want to see is the achievement of participation and inclusion of people with disability in all aspects of society. And we want to develop and commence delivery on all of what we call our charter commitments. And there's a couple of key points to that charter, Jonathan, and your listeners. They are, firstly, the government to lead on inclusion and equity. And the key one we saw to that was, as we all know, we finished a couple of years ago and had the recommendations come out from our Disability Royal Commission. And that was after a 4.5 year struggle for everybody to work through that whole process, of course, during COVID as well, and tell their stories and have that heard by the Commission and have a report come out. One of the key recommendations that AFDO and our membership saw, and a lot of people with disability backed this up, and it was a unanimous one from the commissioners, was recommendation 5.6. And that's to ensure the establishment of a Department of Disability, Equality and Inclusion, and most importantly, from our point of view, to have a dedicated cabinet-level minister for disability rights, equality and inclusion. The aim of that one is to ensure that it takes over all of those things that have previously been looked at. So 5.6 for us is the cornerstone of our campaign. I should firstly point out, Jonathan, that our campaign is jointly operated and partnered by AFDO, the Australian Federation of Disability Organisations, and also our great colleagues from the Australian Autism Alliance. Along with that, we've also had some great support and funding commitments from Deafness Forum of Australia, Deaf Australia, and both of those organisations are AFDO members, along with our good colleagues at Disability Employment Australia. So I'd like to do a shout out to everybody there as well and thank them for all their support and commitment. Doing the partnership with the Australian Autism Alliance, we thought and came up with this charter. So as I mentioned, the overarching theme is about the commitment to disability inclusive and equitable Australia by 2031. The government to lead on disability inclusion and equity. The key cornerstone of that, as I said before, is the 5.6 recommendation to implement that in full from the Disability Royal Commission, our Royal Commission. And then there's a range of other things about improving the public sector employment and accessibility. We'd like to see 15% of positions across all levels in the Australian public service, that's the federal public service, are taken by people with disability. So we want to see that as a priority. We want to see also that there's a disability procurement policy across all government departments, so that's mandating accessibility and diversity in all government contracts. So whoever's supplying to the government has to do that and prove that they're doing that as well. The second one in that is about empowering the voice of people with disabilities, such as what you're doing, Jonathan, with your show here. We want to ensure that people with disability are informed, that people with disability have the power of their voice, that they're able to say and can contribute in through relevant co-design processes of people with disability, on all aspects of policies that the government may be working on that are going to impact on people with disability. We see that as another key cornerstone. Along with that is obviously ensuring that the relevant representative organisations such as AFTO, ours and many others that are around the country, not only on a national but also on the state and territory level basis, are also adequately funded and resourced. We see that as important in order to ensure that the voice of disability comes through in policy decisions, comes through in whatever inquiries governments are doing, and comes through in terms of what's happening with any initiatives that the government might be looking at. The third part of it is enabling inclusion within Australia's workplaces, educational settings and communities. So, Jonathan, we're looking at that by making mandatory reporting on by employers across any organisations that employ 100 plus staff, and making specific mention on that in all educational institutes, again, reinforcing the fact that people with disabilities should be employed and employed across all levels within the organisations that we're talking about. So we want to see some reporting there, so that what we're trying to do there is encourage thinking about ensuring that they have a diverse workforce and that people with disability are part of that. And we think that would make, again, another game change in terms of what's going to happen and the talk that people will then have about the importance of having that diversity in workforce. And we all know that people with disability perform better and undertake much more than people without disability. We know that the results of that over many, many years are that people with disability, let's face it, are better employers than people without disability, and they deliver much better performance. So we think that's important. We think that there's a need to build the disability confidence across the community as well, and we want to see the government committing to do that. But I think, in essence, I've covered off on the main three key areas that we want to see are really a priority through our campaign. There's much more detail, though, Jonathan, in what we've got. The cornerstone of that, as I mentioned earlier, and you've still got it up on the screen, is Recommendation 5.6, delivering on that in full by the next government. And we want to see these things happening quickly and things moving along. So we want to see a commitment within 12 months of whoever the government is that they're going to move on these issues that we've raised.
Thank you. Exploring goal of achieving a workforce comprising at least of 15% of employees identifying as people with disabilities across government departments, agencies, and supply chains.
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. That's a good question and a really important one. If we go back, we do have the Australian Public Service Commission. It's their responsibility to look at a range of targets on diversity and other employment issues on behalf of the Australian Public Service. And what we know from the reporting that they provided in July, they report annually. The reporting they provided in July last year, so the target that they set for employing people with disability across the Australian Public Service, which includes all the government departments, plus the agencies of the federal government. They set a target some years ago of 7%. That was their target. AFTO and many of our member organisations critiqued that at the time. I certainly came out strongly critiquing that as being too low. And what that resulted in, by the way, is in report on that last June, they report every June on it, they'd only achieved a target rate of 5.2%. So they're lagging behind their own touch. By the way, that one expires in June this year. So we get to hear what the next target's going to be. What we're saying in our campaign is that the target needs to be 15%. That needs to be people with disability across all levels within the government departments and the agencies, not coming in and keeping people with disability at base level positions. We want to see them taking an active role in ensuring that people with disability are skilled up and are mentored in order to achieve greater levels within the Australian Public Service. So We think this is very achievable, and we all know there's 5.5 million people with disability across Australia. Therefore, there's at least an active workforce in that of around about 2 million people with disability that are working age that can take up those sorts of roles across the whole Australian public service and their agencies. And some of the agencies are things like the National Disability Insurance Agency. Key there is they're doing much better than the rest of the public service have been doing in terms of reaching that current target. They're actually exceeding that. And we think that they can be used as a beacon, as a lighthouse for the rest of the public service to say, well, how can the National Disability Insurance Agency achieve that? What have they been doing that means that they can make up better target than the 7% which everybody else can't achieve across the Australian public service? How are they doing that? What can we learn from that? Let's get them in to have a discussion about that and learn from what they've been doing and get the lessons from that and apply those across the entire Australian public service and their relevant agencies.
Examine the need for principle-based funding co-developed by national peak disabled people organizations to ensure effective advocacy and support.
Yeah, great question too. And part of our campaign is exactly that. I mentioned that number 2 in our charter is looking at empowering the voice of people with disability. That covers a range of areas, but obviously one that's dear to my heart is about the systemic advocacy agencies such as AFTO that operate on a national basis. And not forgetting, and we do cover in that as well, the individual advocacy agencies that are equally as important right across the states and territories. And also, let's not forget the legal advocacy agencies for people with disability that are essential for a whole range of reasons when people with disability need that legal support and understanding from that legal fraternity. So we think that all of those combined are really important. We think there's been an under-resourcing of those organisations over many, many years. We think that needs to be lifted. And we go back to the fact that we have 5.5 million people with disability in Australia, and that figure's not dwindling, that's growing. And we also know with our rapidly ageing population that you've got a 1 in 2 chance of acquiring a disability if you don't have a disability by the time you turn 65 and above. That tells me there's going to be a lot more people with disability because we've got the ageing population happening right now, and that's not going to let up for the next 20 or 30 years. So we've got those challenges. We need to ensure that the voice of people with disability is heard loud and clear, as I mentioned earlier, across all the government departments, agencies, and in whatever form that needs to take. In order to do that, you actually have to properly resource and fund them. At the moment, we've got some funding that is worked out and applied via government departments, not in consultation with us, not in consultation with what the needs necessarily are, but by some non-transparent mechanism that they do, and then they fund that out. So we want to see that we're part of that process in helping to develop that up. That's not to say we make decisions on who gets what money and that allocation. That's not appropriate. But we want to make sure there is sufficient monies, and we want to see the government pledge to commit more funding towards the national systemic advocacy area, the state territory individual advocacy area, and also that important one of the disability legal advocacy area as well. That's essentially what we want to do, and we want to be part of that, and we think that we have a right to have a voice in that as disabled people's organisations. We think we have a right and a say in what goes on, how much money is actually is allocated, rather than us having to just be very grateful if they give us any sort of money for the work that we do. It's key, and I think people with disability need that representation. And that's not to say that we wouldn't think that there needs to be built self-advocacy skills as well. That's equally as important. But it's also those organisations that operate and represent people with disability on a daily basis. So that's why we think it's important that we're part of the design of what that funding mix is going to be. And we want to see a greater commitment from both of the major parties into what's happening with advocacy. I will say, and we are grateful, that the current ALP government did double the funding for the National Systemic organisations representing everybody across the country. However, it was totally insufficient when they even looked at the amount of money they put into that. So we want to see that there's a bit more rigour put into that, that it's realistic, that it underpins and assists those organisations to actually survive. We're not just delivering on a program, we're delivering on a whole range of issues for people with disability, and we deserve the right as organisations to ensure that we can continue to operate and function, because we still have to have governance things covered, we have to have our operations covered, we have to make sure that we can deliver on that.
And that's how a Department of Disability, Equity and Inclusion could centralize efforts and set standards for accessibility and diversity in public services.
Yeah, and look, that's another part, and I mentioned that earlier, that's a cornerstone of our campaign. 5.6 again is the recommendation for that from our Disability Royal Commission. The commissioners are pretty smart people. They listened to a lot from the community. They heard a lot of testimony, and they worked out this is what we need. And we need that representation again for the 5.5 million Australians that are people with disability. So how would it work? We think that it's going to be an agile department that's going to coordinate and operate with the other areas across various government departments, such as those in transport, those in health, those in education, those in the Attorney General's department. So there's a whole host of, not forgetting Department of Social Services, but it goes on, because all of those departments, and then we get into the agencies such as the National Disability Insurance Agency and many others, they all have, if they don't have a main group of that doing work on disability policy, they certainly have subsets of that of various areas within their departments working on disability policy. It gets back to what that department can do is coordinate all of that work. How many times have we heard about things that happen in health that they haven't consulted, or it hasn't been something that people with disability have been involved with in a co-design or consultation process? And then that's not working in unison with what's happening across the board in transport, or that's not happening in the education area. So we think it's a game changer. We get the department in, they can coordinate with all of those units. You don't have to bring them all into the one department, but what you do have to have is a very solid department that works on coordination and ensuring that disability policy happens in a coordinated manner. And that's not happening at the moment. And we've got many examples of how that doesn't happen on a daily basis for people with disability. That's what we want to see happen there, and that's what we think that can bring.
Thank you. Disregard the potential impact of increasing disability representation in the public sector and ensuring all public buildings adhere to universal design principles.
Yeah, great, Jonathan. And again, that's part of our campaign as you pulled that out. And it really looks at, one is we want the Australian public service to be the beacon for all other industries and how they operate. We want that 15% of Australian public servants to be people with disability across all levels within that public service. And we want to see that then that sets the tone and sets the scene for those private operating businesses to look at that, to experience that, and to realise that people with disability add true value to an organisation. So we see that as essential, one, in doing that, two, in showing that to the rest of the community, and three, in ensuring that, as we said, 5.5 million people out of 26 million Australians are people with disability, and that's going to grow as well. So we want to see that that's reflected in what our public service is and how it performs and how it operates and who are working in that public service. And we also see that that's important then, that will go across to the private enterprise side of things as well. And I mentioned earlier about the procurement policies. We think that that's another way that if you're going to do a government tender, you have to show that you have that diversity in part of what you do within your own organisation in order to get those contracts. So I think it's all about shifting the dial, shifting perception, and ensuring that people with disability aren't invisible, but they're part of general community. That's what we want to see happening. In terms of the public buildings, we think it's really important about the universal design and that that's adopted right across the board. And we're not saying that we want to force everybody to go out and refit buildings, but we think there needs to be a lot more thought. We've got great experience over a decade with a program that we do that actually comes up with low or no cost solutions to a lot of issues that people with disability would experience in businesses on a daily basis. We've got the skills to bring that in. You don't have to go spending hundreds of thousands of dollars to make things a bit more accessible, a bit more in tune with what people with disability need. And that's what we want to get over and make sure that, again, using the Australian Public Service as the lighthouse for others to look at and go, well, they did that and they did that quite effectively. And that can then be explained. Well, it didn't cost a fortune. It's about thinking through what you do with lighting, what you do with access through doorways, weight of doors, handle positions. It's all of that sort of stuff. It's even about just simple things like signage. That's why we think the design principles are really important to bring those in.
Highlight the significance of equitable funding to enable the ROs to effectively engage with the government and advocate for the disability community.
Yeah, I can give you a very simple example, and that's AFTO. We have to spend a lot of time going to chase project funding because our disability representative organisation funding is totally inadequate for us to continue to just do that on our own basis in representing people with disability on a national basis. I'll highlight the word national basis, and we also do international work as well. But let's just talk about the national basis. We need to have something that underpins us in order to deliver on that. There's a lot of work that we need to do. We've got our member communities, organisations, and they represent both disability-specific communities as well as cross-disability or population-based communities. And we think all of those voices are equally as important to make sure that they're heard. Currently, we think there's a bit of a distortion that's gone on with the way the funding mix is going, and we think it's really important that that's recognised. And again, I go back to it should be up to disabled people's organisations to work with the relevant government and the government departments on establishing what those funding parameters are and what works, because having to chase dollars outside of our main work, whilst we always make sure that those projects are in line with our vision and mission of our organisation, that they're delivering for people with disability, it's a hard task and it takes a lot of my time. It takes me away from systemic advocacy work. And it means that we don't have sufficient funds just to continue our operation of our organisation. That's what we mean by that part there. We think it needs to be on an equal footing for all. It needs to be equitable, and it needs to recognise the important communities that we all represent. The other side of that is we can't do effective advocacy if we're still trying to work out how we're going to pay a power bill and where we're going to get some project money to do that. Cost of living impacts on all of our organisations as well. And we want to just ensure that we're able to have some certainty how we can move forward. And we want to work with the government. That's what we want to do. We want to work in a good, solid, trusted advisory role with government, whoever the government is of the day. That's where we think we can add the most value. So having us not having to chase dollars to just underpin our organisations is essential for us to provide the relevant advocacy that will help inform and stop bad policy, help governments to get good policy out there and help them to deliver well on what they want to deliver on as well.
emphasizes the necessity of supporting individual and legal advocacy services to uphold the rights of people with disability.
Yeah, and absolutely essential, Jonathan. And I know your listeners would have had various experiences in utilising the fantastic individual advocacy services that are provided across Australia for people with disability, and the legal advocacy services for people with disability as well in many forums. I was talking about the disability representative organisations. We work at what's called the systemic level, which is the top level with government. But where the rubber hits the road is for a lot of individuals, and they need support at that stage. So we see not only is it important to ensure the funding for and resourcing of the systemic advocacy agencies such as AFTO, because we don't do individual or legal advocacy, but we see it as equally as important to ensure that those individual advocacy agencies and the legal agencies are also underpinned and that they can get on and do their work. Because by sorting out those issues, same as what we do it what's called upstream, so that we don't have problems downstream. They're dealing in what happens in the downstream environment of what's actually occurring on the ground by bad policy, by things that aren't sorted out right for people with disability, by things that need to be changed. They support people with disability on the ground, and we take our hats off to the work that they all do.
Thank you. Discuss how for Australia has united various organizations and individuals to support their mission, including recent endorsements from groups like Leadership Plus and Advocacy WA.
Yeah, great, Jonathan. And look, we have got a lot of support happening at this stage. We're working hard on that, and people can still join up and support us. I'm hoping you're going to give our website a plug for the Fair Australia one. If not, I'll do so at the end. But you can sign up and join us, and we've had a lot of good traction with a lot of great organisations signing on. But individuals can join up as well and voice their support. So I encourage your listeners to also do that. We think we've got a really good charter. We think we've got something that's a bit groundbreaking. We think it's going to make a huge change if we can get this up. If we can get all the things that we want to see, that'd be fantastic. If we can get even half of the things that we put forward in the charter, we'd still be quite happy with that. We want the lot, of course, as you always do when you come up with a campaign. So we think it's really important that everybody gets on board with this campaign after the election, still running forward with it. We've got ads appearing in quite a range now of the marginal seats right around Australia. And you mentioned in their Advocacy WA, I just was on to one of our members hosted an election forum on Monday night. And I was on doing that with our good friends and colleagues and members so shout out to all of the WA listeners, because we think that there's a need for all of us to be solid. There's solidarity in what we're doing with this campaign. So really pleased to get anyone that wants to join us as well now. Please jump on.
Thank you so much, Ross, and best of luck with the campaign. You've been watching CripChat, your weekly podcast on everything disability. Join us next time for more.